Hey everyone, Lucas here and welcome to another video. Today's video is going to be the first of two about the Canon RP. This first video is going to be more about the technical aspects and features that this camera has and why I'm going to explain why I bought this camera and why I chose this camera. And the second video is going to be a field trip with the RP to Banff National Park, which for me is one of my favorite spots here in Canada. Starting, I think from the first question is why did I choose the RP? And for those who don't follow me on Instagram, I was looking for a replacement for one of my DSLRs. And I was searching quite a bit of cameras and other models more expensive than this one. But then I started to evaluate what was important for me, what mattered for me. I come up with the idea to buy the camera that has, let's say, the bare minimum. That would be an improvement from my DSLRs. And I didn't necessarily want to spend a ton of money, because to be honest, I didn't know if I would ever get used to the mirrorless system. So the first thing that you will notice once you take the Canon RP out of the box is that this thing is really small and it's really lightweight. But in contrast, it does feel pretty sturdy, like very good quality stuff. Man, this thing weighs roughly a pound, of course, like just the body and the battery. But just by comparison, my 1D Mark II weighs 3.5 pounds, just the camera and the battery, which is a lot. If you're a landscape photographer, you're going to be hiking a lot, and you will appreciate dumping the extra pounds to have like a lighter camera gear for sure. It's like carrying a bunch of stuff with you like really takes a toll. So let's talk a bit about the technical specifications of this camera. So the Canon RP has a 26.2 full frame sensor, and it has the Digic 8 processor, which is the same one that was used for the Canon 60 Mark II. The autofocus of this camera is really good. It has the technology of Canon, the dual pixel autofocus. Not going to get into the details on this thing, but one thing I need to say, it's really fast, it's really good. Even more when I compare it to my old DSLRs, like I feel like this autofocus system is just really good. First thing about having a 26.2 megapixel sensor is that I can make larger prints, which is really good for landscape photographers. And the second item is that I can have more freedom to crop things out of the frame without losing too much in terms of details and too many pixels. Just by comparison, my Canon 1D Mark II is an 8 megapixel camera. The 5D Mark I is 12 megapixels, and the 7D is 18. So having the 26.2 for this guy here, it's a very good improvement for me for sure. For landscape photographers, I think 3 points are the key features or key aspects for any camera. Those would be the ISO, the dynamic range, and also the color depth. I'm gonna be talking about these aspects now. I also will talk about shutter speed and the frames per second on this camera, but these were not much relevant for me since I'm a landscape photographer. I'm not into sports, I'm not into nothing really that's it's a fast moving object. let's start with ISO. This camera has a very good performance in terms of ISO, even when you compare it with another mirrorless cameras. And if you think that this cost $1,300, I think the ISO performance of this camera it's amazing. The ISO is very important for low light scenes, and let's say if you're shooting astrophotography or any kind of events that's indoors and with poor lighting conditions. It deals with the amount of noise that's generated by the camera, and which at the end of the day is going to degrade the quality of your pictures, the sharpness of your pictures. So having a good ISO performance was a requirement for me. I took 4 shots, the first one with ISO 100, just to get a feeling on what is the minimum noise generated by this camera. I bumped up the ISO to 800, to 3200, 6400, 12,800 and 40,000. So I'm just going to start showing you now a comparison side by side between the ISO 100 and the other ones that I used. The first shot I took using an ISO of 100. Like I said, this can be considered the minimum amount of noise that the RP will produce in a well-exposed picture. For the second shot, I bumped the ISO to 800, and for me there's barely any noise on the image. Let's move to the third shot, ISO 3200. There is noise, but it is quite easy to reduce this noise on post-processing, so I would be totally comfortable with that. So the fourth shot, bumping the ISO to 6400, and as you can see, the level of noise has increased, but to be honest, it's still manageable. I can't still have a good result after putting this feature through post-processing, noise reduction and sharpness. I took 2 more shots with ISO 12,800 and 40,000, but these are way too noisy and I would not push the ISO that far. It's good to know that if I need to push the ISO all the way to 6400, I know that I can get good quality pictures with this camera in, and this is very good for a $1,300 camera. Another very important parameter for landscape photographers is the dynamic range. And the dynamic range of this camera in comparison with other mirrorless cameras is not the best. The RP's dynamic range falls short if you're comparing, for instance, with the Sony A7R Mark III. To be honest, that's kind of an expected trade-off, because instead of paying $3,500 in a camera, I'm paying only $1,300. So I know that I would have a less than ideal dynamic range with this camera. But even though dynamic range is really important in terms of landscape photography, I'm gonna be honest with you, it's not going to make or break you as a landscape photographer, okay? It's way less about equipment and way more about the photographer. You just need to know how to use and how to get the best from the equipment you have. In terms of comparison of the dynamic range from this camera with my old DSLRs, then yes, I have it is an improvement, because the dynamic range for my 7D, my 5D, and my 1D are in the range of 11.1 to 11.7 exposure values. This camera has a dynamic range of 11.9. Even though the dynamic range falls short in comparison with other mirrorless cameras, in comparison with my DSLRs, I have an improvement here, so that's a plus as well. Another important parameter, let's say, for landscape photography is the color depth, and I think that's one of the main features of this camera. Color depth is pretty important because it's how your camera reads and translates the nuances in terms of colors and shades of colors in the image. This camera has a color depth of 24.3 bits, and just by comparison, it is roughly 2 bits more than my old DSLRs. This camera doesn't have the color depth of the Nikon Z6 and the Sony A7 Mark III, but it falls short only 1 bit, and to be honest, 1 bit is not that noticeable. I took some pictures of the northern lights and some sunsets here, and I love the way the color look straight out of the camera. So the 24.3 color depth for this camera, it's really good, and I mean really good for its price. Don't forget that even though it's 1 bit behind the Sony A7 Mark III and the Nikon Z6, this camera costs half of their price. One of the things that, at least for me, it's not important, but I want to mention here that this camera is probably not the best for fast actions and stuff like that, because it shoots only 5 frames per second without using tracking autofocus. But if you're using tracking, then it goes to 4, which is roughly what my Canon 5D, which is a roughly 15-year-old camera, does. I think that camera shoots like 3 frames per second. And this, coupled with the fact that the fastest shutter speed of this camera is 1/4000th of a second, instead of having like 1/8000th of a second, means that this camera was not designed to be a sports camera or a camera that will be used for a serious wildlife photographer. Another of the cons of this camera is battery life. Even if we compare the battery life of this camera with other mirrorless cameras, this battery is pretty bad. And if I compare this, my DSLR's batteries, this thing is garbage. I probably can get anywhere from 200 to 300 pictures with one single charge. So because of that, having extra batteries for this camera is a must. It uses the LPE17, which is the same battery used for some of the EOS M series of cameras, and also some Rebels as well. I think the T6i and the T6 use the same battery. And another thing is, it does charge via USB, but only when the camera is off. If the camera is on, it doesn't charge. So that's kind of annoying, because even my GoPro 8 Black can record videos and be charged at the same time via USB. So I really don't understand why this camera could not do the same. So let's talk about video now then. This camera shoots in 720p in 30 and 60 frames per second, in 1080p in 24, 30 and 60, and 4K only in 24 frames per second. The thing is, like, if you're shooting 4K on this camera, it will lose the dual pixel autofocus system, which for me is a huge downfall for the video capabilities of the RP. Not to mention also that if you're recording a video in 4K, it will apply a really heavy crop on your footage. So just by comparison, now I'm recording this video in another RP in 1080p, and I'm gonna just record a little video here on this one here, and using the 4K. This is I'm probably going to put this camera side by side with this camera here, just so you can see the difference in terms of cropping and the autofocus system. And let's do it. So this is a comparison between the 4K capabilities and the 1080p. My camera is still struggling to get the focus right here. It's taking way too long, and I'm using the eye focus and the eye tracking and stuff like that, and it's taking like forever. Now it got me. And And look the difference. This camera here, I can move back and forth, and the focus is always stock sharp on me. These are the same cameras. It's just a matter of having the dual pixel autofocus activated on 1080p and not activating in 4K, which brings me to the point that if video is something really important for you and you want to record videos in 4K, this is not a camera for you. You need to look for another body. For me, my videos are always in 1080p, and basically they are my YouTube channel videos. So I'm okay with only 1080p, having the possibility to record in 6 frames per second and slow down in post-processing for 30, so you can have like a little bit of a slow motion effect. So I'm happy with that, but keep in mind that if you really want to shoot in 4K, this camera is not for you. One thing that it's probably not a huge upgrade for you guys, but I was using old DSLRs like I mentioned before, so how easy it is to connect this camera with my other device like my phone, my laptop, and my desktop camera. It's amazing. I can shoot remotely without having to carry like a little trigger that I used to have for my DSLRs. I can pretty much command all the settings, exposure, autofocus, and everything just using my phone, and for me that's really good. Of course, for probably the most of you guys, that's not going to be something that you'll be thrilled about because you probably have newer cameras than I have. So, but for me, that was a huge plus for this camera. All the technical data here that I talked about or that I put here around the frame, I took from the dxomark.com. So I'm gonna put the link to the description of this video to the analysis they made on the sensor of the Canon RP. Another thing is, like, most of the features that I was interested in, I really like about the Canon RP could be found in other cameras as well. But what made me decide for getting the RP, like I mentioned before, is that I could get everything that I needed in a camera that cost me $1,300. So that's all that I have for today. Thanks for watching, and next week's video is going to be the field test of this camera in Banff National Park. So if that's something that you're interested in, stick with me, and I will see you on the next video.